So in the last video, as we discussed and learned about the circular flow in quite a lot of detail, we concluded that whole discussion with this national income identity, which we learned tells us that when a country's circular flow is in an equilibrium, then the country's GDP, or the market value of that country's total output, it is equal to both the total spending as well as the national income that is generated in that country. And that, we said, gives us three different ways in which we can measure a country's GDP: the output approach, or the expenditure approach, or the income approach. Now we are going to look at all of these different approaches in slightly more detail, not a lot of detail, but we are going to start off first of all in this video by looking at this output approach. Now the target is to develop a simple numerical example that reflects how this output approach can be used. And basically through that numerical analysis, our main purpose, or you can say the second main purpose, is also to learn the difference between real and nominal GDP and how we can convert the growth rates of nominal GDP into the growth rates of real GDP. So we will achieve all of that as we go through this output approach towards measuring the country's GDP. So let me start off with this definition of a GDP, which so far we have said is the market value of total output. But do remember that formally we define it as the market value of the total output of all the final goods and services which are produced within a country during a given period of time. Now, out of all of these different things that I have underlined, remember that the main purpose of measuring or calculating GDP is to get an estimate of the country's total output. That is, we said that it is a macro level indicator, a very important indicator, that what is the total amount of all the goods that the country is producing, this total output. And since it is impossible to add different things such as cars with apples with clothes to get at some aggregate number which tells you the total output, that is why we have to convert the output of every product into its market value. And we then add all the market values, and that is our estimate of the country's total output, the market value of all the different goods that are being produced, and that is what is known as the country's GDP. Now let me just take some numbers over here so this thing becomes more concrete. How do we convert the output into market value? So let's assume that we have a simple innocent country which just produces two goods, chairs and tables. And let's assume that in this country produces 50 chairs and the price of every chair is 40 rupees. So the market value of chairs would simply be this quantity of 50 into the price per chair of 40 rupees, or 2000 rupees. And then on the other hand, if this country, let's say, produces 100 tables and the price of every table is 70 rupees, then the market value of tables would be 7,000. And therefore, the country's GDP, we would say, the market value of both these goods, the sum of that market value, the country's GDP, would be 9,000 rupees. So that is what we mean by market value of the total output. Now the rest of the definition, it's important. It includes some important meanings. So let me take you through that. So GDP, it's this market value of all the final goods and services. Now all simply means that you will include the market value of everything, every good and every service that your country produces. That is simple enough. This thing, final goods and services, this is important. Because you see, if your country produces something like bread, and the price of that bread is, let's say, 15 rupees, then we are saying that you should just include the market value of this final product, bread, in the calculation of GDP, the value of things that your country has produced. Don't start including the value or the price of wheat as well as flour and as well as the plastic packaging that goes into making this bread. All of these intermediate goods, whatever value they added, that is included in the price of the final product. So that is why we always stress, don't include the value of intermediate goods, don't include the value of inputs, just include the value of all the final goods and services. Because if you include the final goods and services value as well as the value of inputs, then economists say you would end up double counting what your economy is actually producing. You will overstate the value of what your country is actually producing. So that is something that you can mention in some of your essay questions, get a couple of marks here and there. And moving on, the other part of this definition is saying that GDP is the value of output of all final goods produced within a country during a given period of time. Now, within a country, it simply means that if you are trying to measure the GDP of Pakistan, then anything that is produced within the border of this country, regardless of whether it's a Chinese person doing that production or an Indian person living and working in Pakistan or an American person, that doesn't matter. The citizenship, the nationality doesn't matter when you are calculating GDP. All that matters is whether that product, that service has been produced inside the country of Pakistan, whether it's within the borders of that country. And if it is, it will be part of the country's GDP. Now, there is another related concept, GNP or gross national product, which is again a way of measuring the value of output, but that the value of output that is produced by the nationals of a particular country. So GNP of Pakistan would mean all the output that is produced by Pakistanis, whether they are living in Pakistan or outside of Pakistan. So we'll talk more about this GNP later in this section, but let us move on now. So the final part of this definition of GDP tells you that it's the value of output of all goods and services produced within a country during a given period of time, which simply means that this GDP is the flow concept. So you would measure the GDP for a particular year, such as let's say 2015, which would mean that you calculate the market value of all the goods that have been produced during this entire year of 2015. And then in the next year, 2016, you will again see the number of chairs and the numbers of tables that this country is producing. And you will again measure the market value. And again, that would give you the GDP of that country in 2016. So let's bring in some more number. Let's assume that this country continues to produce 50 chairs in 2016 as well, and the same number of tables. But let's assume the price increases by 10%. So chairs, instead of 40, their price increases to 44, and tables from 70, their price, let's assume, increases to 77, a 10% increase. Now, if you calculate the market value of chairs, that would come out to be 2,200, and this would, the market value of tables, that would be 7,700. And if you add the two, you will get the country's GDP in the year 2016. So that is what we mean by a given period of time. This is usually 1 year's period. So those are first of all the basics of how you formally define GDP and the sort of calculations that are involved. Now, every country would actually do these calculations, and every year they would try to figure out what is the output of all the different goods, what are their prices. They will convert, therefore, those products outputs into market values, add them up, and report that country's GDP in these money terms. Now, when you're reporting this GDP in money terms, we say that we are talking about nominal GDP. Now, a formal or a more useful way of remembering or defining what nominal GDP is that we say that nominal GDP is the market value of the total output of all the goods, so all of the supplies, and then we add that it's the market value which is valued at the current year's price. Let me explain what do we mean by that. Valued at current year's price. Now what that means is that if you are trying to measure the GDP of 2015, then you will look at the quantity of each product such as chairs, and you will convert it into market value by using the price of chairs in that same year, 2015. You are using the current year's price. And then when you are trying to calculate the GDP of 2016, then you will multiply the amount of chairs you make in 2016 with obviously the price of these chairs in that same year. So nominal GDP, GDP valued at current year prices. Now there is an issue that you run into when you measure these nominal GDPs, because you see economists, they are not interested in making all of these calculations. What economists are really interested in is the growth rate of GDP. So let me write it down. They are interested in the growth rate of GDP. What do we mean by growth rate? So 2015 is the first year, so there is no comparison. But in 2016, economists would see that, okay, 2016, the GDP is 9,900. In the last year, it was 9,000. So 2016, this GDP has grown in this year by 10%. And this GDP growth is what economists would really look at. And through this GDP growth, they want to estimate by how much is the total output of the country increasing. And therefore, the speed at which the economy is expanding. But the issue and the problem is that, look, nominal GDP, which you are saying you just multiply the quantity of every product with price. Nominal GDP may increase even if total output stays the same, which is happening over here in the numbers we have assumed. In 2015, you produce 50 chairs, 100 tables. In 2016, you produce exactly the same amount of both the goods. So your total output has not increased. But prices in 2015 were 40 and 70. In 2016, they are 44 and 77. Prices have increased by 10%. And when you do these calculations, you see your nominal GDP, it is growing by exactly that 10%, the rate at which your prices have grown. So if you look at this nominal GDP growth of 10%, you cannot tell whether this is output increasing or it's just this price increasing, or whether it's a mix of both. And that is where economists bring in the idea of real GDP. Now, real GDP, you can simply define it as GDP, again the same thing, market value of the output and so on and so forth, but it is measured in a way that controls for the change in prices. Or you can say real GDP is the GDP which is valued using fixed base year prices. Now, what do we mean by base year? Well, actually, we don't mean anything at all. Base year literally is any randomly chosen selected year. And the whole idea is that, look, we still want to convert output into its market value so that we have everything in rupees and we can add up the total market value. But we want to avoid this problem that even when output doesn't change and only prices change, your nominal GDP is capturing that in its growth. We don't want that. We don't want the GDP to show us a growth when actual output is not increasing. But we still want to use prices because we have to convert things into market value. So we pick randomly a year and call it a base year. So let's assume we pick 2015 as the base year. And all that means is that, look, we will assume that the price of all the products in the economy, their prices are fixed at the base year prices. And whenever we have to calculate the GDP of any year, whenever we have to convert the output of any year into the market value, we will not look at the price of that particular year. Instead, we'll use the prices of this base year. So in 2015, the nominal GDP was calculated using these prices, and since 2015 is also the base year, so the real GDP, and this remember is the nominal, So the real GDP in 2015 will again use the base year, same prices. So in the base year, this nominal and real GDP will turn out to be exactly the same. But in all the other years, things will change, because nominal GDP of 2016 was valued using that same 2016's prices, which were increasing and therefore showing you a growth. But now, to calculate real GDP, you will convert these 50 chairs into market value by multiplying them with the price of this base year. And you will convert the number of tables into a market value using the price of this base year, which will allow you to convert these quantities into market values. But this price, whether it changes or not, doesn't matter. You are using a fixed price. And in 2017, again, you will look at the quantity of tables and chairs, but you won't multiply them with the price in 2017. You'll multiply those quantities with the price of the fixed base year. And what it does is, if you do the calculations for 2016, 50 into 40 plus 100 into 70, you will get GDP, the total market value of 9,000 rupees. This is your real GDP. And you see immediately, if you look at the growth of real GDP from 2015 to 2016, there is 0% growth. And that is a true reflection of what is happening to output. It is not growing. It is what it was. It was just prices that changed. But real GDP, through using base years, have control for these prices. So now the growth rate of GDP, they actually reflect the true rate of growth of total output. So that is the difference between nominal and real GDP, which can be a bit confusing since this is perhaps for some of you your first introduction to nominal versus real. But out of all of this, the main thing that you want to remember and understand is that, look, it's the real GDP that actually matters. You want to measure or assess the amount of output that is being produced, and more importantly, the rate at which that output is increasing every year. And that is something that is reflected in the growth of real GDP, which is the market value calculated using fixed base year prices, or we say which is the market value which is adjusted for price changes. This nominal GDP is just a way of, getting to this. But does that mean that nominal GDP is totally useless? Well, it is not totally useless. Because you see, as I just said, it's the growth rates of GDP, of real GDP, that you are interested in. And as far as the growth rates are concerned, and let me do it here. Now, what I'm going to tell you is something that comes very, very specifically in your MCQs and very repetitively. So I won't want to go into a lot of detail, but I want you to understand one thing, one use of nominal GDP that you will be tested upon. If you are given the rate of growth of nominal GDP, not the level, the rate of growth of nominal GDP, and if you are given the rate of inflation in the economy, that is, if you are told the rate of growth of nominal GDP is, let's say, 20% in a particular year, and in that year the inflation in that country is, let's say, 5%. Now, for those who don't know, inflation simply means the average percentage increase of prices in the economy. So inflation of 5% means that on average the price of every other thing is increasing by 5%. Now, if you know both these two things, you can measure, or you can calculate the growth of real GDP. Now again, I don't want to go into any details, but just memorize this thing, that if your nominal GDP is growing by 20%, whereas inflation is 5%, then it is simple to see that, look, out of this entire growth of 20, 5 is because of inflation, and the rest of it, 15%, will be your rate of growth of a real GDP. So you can think of it like this: nominal GDP, this is equal to price into quantity. Now, if this whole nominal GDP is increasing by 20%, out of it 5% is the rate of increase of price. then the rest of 15% must be the rate of increase in the total output, the real GDP. So again, don't make it complicated. Just remember this equation. Nominal GDP growth minus the rate of inflation gives you real GDP growth. And then another variation of this question is when the examiner, in addition to giving you the growth rate of nominal GDP and the inflation rate, he will also give you the growth rate of the country's population. And then he will ask you to figure out the growth of GDP or real GDP per capita. Now, per capita simply means per person. So how do you calculate GDP per person? You divide the GDP by population. So if your GDP is growing by 10% and your population is growing by 3%, we say that GDP per person will be growing by 10 minus 3. That is, you are producing 10% more things, but you also have 3% more people. So net, the GDP per person is increasing by 7%. So what you will see, therefore, in your exam is you will have nominal GDP growth rate, you will have inflation rate, and you will have the rate of population growth rate. And when you will have to calculate the growth of real GDP per capita, then what you will have to do is you will subtract the growth rate of nominal GDP, or from the growth rate of nominal GDP, you will first subtract inflation. That will give you real GDP. And then you will subtract the rate of growth of population, and that would give you the growth of real GDP per capita. So this is, again, as I have been telling you, an equation that you need to remember. Now I will give you reference to the past exam questions that will give you a very, very good practice. There are quite a lot of questions, but they are so repetitive, they are so similar. They just pick up any 4 or 5, go through them, and that is it.